sweet like a buttercup. You're a Barbie doll. Show them all what I'm made of. Strut down the hall. Won't stop till I get enough.
Hey everyone, and welcome to this deep dive. Today, we're going way beyond the headlines, and we're going to be exploring something called the long tail of consequences.
Yeah.
You might be thinking, oh, okay, but what does that actually mean? And trust me, it's a lot more fascinating than it sounds.
Oh, it really is.
It is, right.
It's about those actions, those decisions that seem to have a ripple effect, lasting far longer than anyone might have predicted. And today we're using a pretty high-profile example to illustrate this Will Smith and that Oscar slap.
Will Smith on the slap, right. It's been, can you believe it, 3 years since that happened? March 2022, Chris Rock makes a joke about Jada Pinkett-Smith. Will Smith walks up on stage, slap. It was the moment everyone was talking about.
It was huge.
It was, but here's what's interesting.
Yeah.
According to this article from the Hindustan Times, the consequences for Will Smith, they're still unfolding.
I mean,
even now in 2025.
It's wild, isn't it? A split-second decision with years of fallout. And that's the heart of this long tail idea.
Okay.
Think of it like this, right?
All right.
You drop a pebble in a pond.
Yeah.
The initial splash is big, but then you've got these ripples that spread out.
Right.
Reaching way beyond that initial point of impact.
Okay.
That's what we're talking about here.
Okay, I'm starting to get it. I'm starting to get the picture. So how does this long tail idea apply to Will Smith specifically? What are some of the actual consequences he's facing 3 years after the fact?
Well, the Hindustan Times article points to a few things.
Okay.
For one, there's been a noticeable shift in how Hollywood studios perceive Will Smith. There's hesitation to work with him, which has resulted in him losing out on some major roles. It's almost like this cloud of uncertainty hanging over his career.
So it's not just about the act itself, but how that act has changed people's perception of him within the industry.
Exactly. And it's not just Hollywood. This happens in business too, right? One bad product launch, one questionable decision by the CEO, and suddenly investor confidence plummets. It can take years to rebuild trust.
Right.
And sometimes the damage is irreparable.
Wow. Okay. I'm seeing how this long tail idea can apply to so many different situations.
Yeah.
It makes you realize that every action has the potential to set off a chain of events.
Absolutely. And sometimes those chains are harder to break than others.
Right.
Take the environment, for instance.
Oh, yeah. Good point.
Pollution in one small area can disrupt entire ecosystems with consequences that play out over decades.
That's a good point. Yeah, for sure.
It's all connected.
Okay, so we've got a good grasp on what long-tail consequences means, but here's what I'm curious about. Why are the repercussions for Will Smith so lasting? I mean, people mess up, right?
Yeah.
Shouldn't there be some point where we move on?
You're right. People do make mistakes.
Yeah.
And forgiveness is important. But I think in Will Smith's case, there are a few factors at play that make this incident particularly sticky. For starters, the nature of the act itself, a public display of violence, is something society tends to take very seriously, right?
Right.
It's not something you can easily brush aside.
Right. And it wasn't just any public event, it was the Oscars.
Oh, totally.
Talk about a global stage, millions of people watching, the whole world talking about it the next day.
Right. And then you layer on the fact
that
we're in an era where accountability is huge.
Oh, yeah.
Social media has amplified the power of public opinion, and people are quick to call out behavior they see as unacceptable.
Oh, yeah, that whole cancel culture debate.
Right.
It feels like everyone's walking on eggshells these days, worried about saying or doing the wrong thing.
That's one way to look at it, but let's unpack that term for a second, because cancel culture gets thrown around a lot without a clear definition.
Right, yeah.
At its core, it's about the idea that individuals or entities should face social or professional consequences for actions or statements deemed offensive or harmful.
Okay, so it's not just about disagreeing with someone. It's about actively trying to hold them accountable for their actions.
Right, and that accountability can take many forms.
Yeah.
Boycotts, public criticism,
Yeah.
calls for resignation, even just unfollowing someone on social media.
Yeah.
And it's definitely a hot-button topic.
Oh, yeah.
With valid arguments on both sides.
I can see that.
Yeah.
On one hand, it feels important to hold people accountable for their actions, especially when those actions cause harm.
Yeah.
But on the other hand,
Yeah.
it can also feel like things get blown out of proportion and there's not much room for nuance or forgiveness.
You've hit the nail on the head.
Yeah.
It's a complex issue.
It is.
With no easy answers, and it's this complexity that we're going to dive into next.
Okay, before we do that,
Okay.
I want to throw this out to you listening.
Yeah.
Think about other instances where someone's actions had those lasting consequences, maybe even years later. What makes some events stick in our minds more than others? Is it the nature of the act itself, the social context, the people involved? What do you think?
So before the break, you were asked to think about why some events and their consequences just seem to stick more than others.
Yeah.
It's an interesting question, isn't it?
It really is. I was thinking about it during the break, and it's almost like there's this collective memory. You know,
Yeah.
certain events become part of our cultural narrative, and they shape how we view the world.
Absolutely. And this ties into the idea of social norms,
Okay.
which are constantly evolving. What might have been acceptable or easily forgiven in the past
Right.
is now viewed through a different lens.
Totally.
Think about how much has changed, even in the last decade.
Oh, totally. The way we communicate, the way we consume information, the way we hold people accountable, it's all different now.
Exactly.
And you mentioned social media earlier, which I think plays a huge role in this shift.
It does. Social media has created this environment of constant scrutiny where everything is documented and amplified.
Right.
It's like we're all living in a giant digital panopticon.
Okay, panopticon. I'm going to need you to explain that one.
Sure.
It sounds kind of ominous.
It is a bit ominous. It's this concept from the philosopher Jeremy Bentham
Okay.
describing a prison where the inmates are constantly under surveillance.
Okay.
They never know when they're being watched, so they behave as if they're always being watched.
Right.
And in a way, social media has created a similar dynamic.
Okay.
We're all aware that our actions can be recorded, shared, and judged by a global audience.
Wow, that's kind of unsettling when you put it like that.
Yeah.
But I get your point. It feels like there's this constant pressure to present a certain image, to be careful about what you say or do, because you never know what might go viral or be taken out of context.
Exactly. And this heightened sense of scrutiny definitely contributes to the longevity of consequences. It's not just about the initial act anymore. It's about how that act is perceived, shared, and debated in the online world.
And this brings us back to Hollywood, right? Because the Will Smith incident wasn't just a personal matter. It became this huge public spectacle, dissected and debated endlessly online.
It did, and it really brought to light the complexities of Hollywood as a system, particularly the power dynamics at play.
Right.
Who has the power to speak up? Whose voices are amplified? How are consequences distributed? These are questions that the industry has been grappling with for decades.
Right. And you mentioned #MeToo earlier, which feels like a pivotal moment in this conversation.
Yeah.
Suddenly, all these stories of abuse and harassment that had been whispered about for years were being brought into the light.
Absolutely. #MeToo was a watershed moment, forcing Hollywood to confront its systemic issues. And it had a direct impact on how controversies are handled, leading to a greater emphasis on accountability and transparency.
It feels like there's a real shift happening, a move away from the old boys club mentality that protected certain individuals and swept things under the rug.
There is. It's not a perfect system by any means, but there's a growing awareness that the old ways are no longer acceptable. And this applies not just to Hollywood, but to all institutions and industries.
Okay, so we've talked about changing social norms, the impact of social media, and the shifting power dynamics in Hollywood, but let's get back to Will Smith for a second. You mentioned earlier that he's lost out on some major roles because of the Oscar slap.
Right.
Can you give us some specific examples from the Hindustan Times article? What kind of projects are we talking about?
Well, the article doesn't name specific films, but it does state that several major studios have put projects involving Smith on hold. It quotes an unnamed industry insider who says, "There's a lot of hesitation to attach Will Smith to a big budget film right now. The risk is just too high."
So it's not just about public perception, but about actual financial concerns.
Exactly. Studios are worried about potential backlash from audiences, sponsors, and even their own employees.
Right.
They're weighing the financial benefits of working with a star like Will Smith against the potential damage to their brand. And in many cases, they're deciding that the risk isn't worth it.
Wow, that's a tough spot to be in. It really highlights how these long-tail consequences can impact every aspect of someone's career, not just their reputation.
It does, and it raises a really interesting question. How do we as a society determine the appropriate length and severity of consequences?
Right.
Is there a point where we move from holding someone accountable to actually hindering their ability to grow and evolve?
Oh, that's a good one. And it feels especially relevant in Will Smith's case because he did apologize for his actions.
Right.
He even resigned from the academy, but it seems like the consequences are still very much in play.
They are, and this gets to the heart of the debate about forgiveness and redemption. Where do we draw the line between holding someone accountable and allowing space for them to learn and grow from their mistakes?
It feels like we're in this weird in-between space with Will Smith. Like he's faced consequences, he's apologized. But is there room for him to fully recover in the public eye? Can he ever truly move past this?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And honestly, it's a question we grapple with as a society all the time.
Yeah.
When does accountability
Right.
turn into something that prevents someone from growing, from making amends, from ultimately being better?
It's interesting because while we've been focusing on Will Smith, this whole discussion about consequences and redemption,
Right.
it feels so much bigger than just one person.
It does.
It makes you think about all the other examples, both big and small, where we're trying to figure out how to navigate these complex issues.
You're so right. Every day we see stories about people facing backlash for things they've said or done, sometimes years ago.
Right.
It makes you wonder, is there a statute of limitations on our mistakes? At what point can we as individuals and as a society say, okay, you messed up, you've been held accountable, now let's move forward?
It's a tough one, and I think part of the challenge is that there's no one-size-fits-all answer.
Right.
Each situation is unique, and there are so many factors to consider. The severity of the action, the intent behind it, the sincerity of the apology, the efforts made to make amends. It's a lot.
It is. And to complicate things even further,
Yeah.
public perception plays a huge role.
Oh, for sure.
Sometimes, even if someone has genuinely taken responsibility and made efforts to change,
Yeah.
the court of public opinion remains unforgiving.
Yeah, it feels like once that narrative is set, once someone is labeled as a certain type of person, it can be really hard to shake that perception.
It can, and this is where social media becomes a double-edged sword.
Right.
On one hand, it allows for greater transparency and accountability, but on the other hand, it can also create this echo chamber where negative narratives are amplified
Right.
and forgiveness becomes almost impossible.
So how do we find that balance? How do we hold people accountable while also allowing space for growth and redemption?
That's the ongoing challenge, isn't it? I don't think there's a simple solution, a magic formula.
Right.
But I do think it starts with recognizing the humanity in each other, even in those who've made mistakes.
Okay.
It's about being willing to listen, to understand different perspectives, and to consider the possibility that people can change.
It's about approaching these situations with a bit more empathy and a bit less judgment.
Exactly. And it's about remembering that none of us are perfect.
Right.
We've all made mistakes, and we've all needed a second chance at some point in our lives.
That's true.
So the next time you see a story about someone facing consequences for their actions, take a moment to pause and consider the bigger picture.
Oh.
Think about the complexity of the situation, the possibility of growth, and the importance of extending grace even when it's difficult.
That's such a powerful thought to leave our listeners with. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. The long tail of consequences, the impact of social media, the shifting landscape of Hollywood, and this complex dance between accountability and redemption. It's a lot to process, but hopefully it's sparked some new insights and given you some things to ponder.
And if there's one key takeaway from all of this, it's that these conversations matter.
They do.
They shape how we interact with each other, how we hold each other accountable, and ultimately how we create a more just and compassionate world.
So keep those conversations going, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep those brains buzzing. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll catch you next time.
Sound the alarm. I'm coming up. We'll have a ball. I'm sweet like a buttercup. You're a Barbie doll. Show them all what